Hi, everyone. Welcome to Beyond the Session, the podcast where you get free therapy and we get free advertising. The show is brought to you by Reset Counselling and Psychotherapy in Barrie. Our old name is Lindsay Sagan Associates, but we're rolling out a new look. I asked ChatGPT to come up with a tagline for our show today, and it said, "Welcome to Therapist After Party, where therapists let down their hair and speak their minds." So here you have it. We're going off script and sharing what's on our minds. Today, we're taking down mental health myths. I'm here in the therapy room with Jessica Capra and Andi Atkins, who are both registered psychotherapists, and they've both been with our team for several years. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Kathleen. Thanks for having us.
Andi, I want to ask you about how you navigate common misconceptions about mental health in your practice and what kind of strategies you use to debunk them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a big one that comes to mind for me that I hear a lot from people coming in is they're actually concerned that they are not doing bad enough in their life. And they wonder, is therapy only for people who, have a severe mental illness or people who are, having a lot of trouble functioning in their day-to-day life? And I mean, I definitely validate that point of view. I can see, maybe why people would have that perception. And I think that in the past, it probably was the case that it was only some people who were very unwell were the people who went to therapy. But I mean, I would argue that anybody can benefit from therapy, regardless of whether you have a diagnosed mental illness or even specific mental health concerns, right? Therapy, it's there to meet you where you're at. So if you're doing great in various domains of your life, but maybe you still have something you want to talk about or a goal that you want to work towards, or even just be able to bounce some ideas off of somebody else. I mean, therapy can be just as much for you as it is for somebody who is struggling with severe depression or something like that. So I think reassuring people that everyone's struggles are valid. I hear something a lot from people along the lines of, I have a great family, I have a roof over my head, I have, food to eat. I don't really think that I, have the right to complain, sort of thing. And I have a lot of empathy for that. I mean, I can hear that comes from a place of wanting to keep things in perspective and, being grateful for what we have. But I also think it's pretty unfair to oneself to think that way, because we all have our struggles, regardless of, what privileges or other things we might have going on in our life. And, like we've said, it's meeting you where you're at.
So we're trying to talk today about some common barriers that prevent individuals from seeking therapy and how you work to overcome them. And actually, before we turned on the record button, we were already talking about this, barriers that might stop someone from coming to therapy or might make them feel wary of getting in a room with a therapist. In your experience, Jessica, how do you speak to the type of atmosphere that a client's coming into and how that might affect their experience in therapy?
Great question. I think transparency is really important for creating and maintaining safe environments. Therapists are human, and the majority of us have chosen this field for very personal reasons. And I think that's part of it, really bringing in a humility to the therapy process, providing clear, direct communication and offering plain language while we're supporting people, I think really helps create and foster safe environments.
Yeah, for sure.
Building rapport right off the bat, I think, is part of this. Creating safe spaces requires that we feel safe together and that you feel comfortable talking. And so how do we do that? I think a big one also for me that I do is I give people permission not to share, right?
Sure.
Like right off the top. Yes, we're here to share, right? People are coming to therapy to share their experiences. But when you choose to share and giving people that power to choose, I think also creates and fosters that safe environment. A couple other things came to mind, providing sort of consistent, flexible support. So meeting people where they're at, For example, if there's a learning disability or ADHD involved, I'm going to ask, is this environment okay for you? What do you need in this space to sort of feel safe to share and sit here with me? Also asking for feedback often, right? Like, how was the session for you? What are some reflections that you're having? Is there anything that needs to be different? Are we not meeting your expectations for what this process is? And right off the bat, when asking people about what are their goals, that's where it starts, where we start creating safe spaces. And really, people are the experts of themselves. I just sort of support them. I guess the only other thing that I want to share here that kind of came to mind with this question was this neutral stance, right? Non-judgmental stance that we hear in sort of DBT. And that's that includes language, body posture, how I respond, the language that I'm using. So, I guess in a nutshell, that's kind of how I foster sort of these safe environments.
Jessica, you made a really good point about when making clients, comfortable in the therapeutic setting, how it is important for them to realize that they are in control of what they share. And I always like to emphasize to clients that informed consent, which is, what we obtain from you at the beginning of our work together, and really it's an ongoing process throughout our sessions together. That informed consent is an ongoing process, and it doesn't give us, carte blanche to ask you anything we like or to expect you to divulge anything that maybe you don't want to talk about or you don't want to talk about right now. So I think that that's an important piece as well. I can imagine and I can understand that some people come to therapy or are worried about coming to therapy because they don't want to be put on the spot, or maybe there's certain things they're not ready to talk about yet, or they want to, as many people do, develop that relationship with the therapist before they feel sort of safe to go there. And I mean, that actually makes a lot of sense from a scientific perspective, especially if it comes to trauma or something like that. It's often not beneficial to just sort of spill out your trauma if you're not feeling comfortable, if you don't have that relationship in place already. So for anybody who does have those concerns, I mean, I can definitely hear where you're coming from. And I think it's important to know that most therapists, or at least the therapists that we have here, are very emphatic about leaving that up to you, how far you want to go, what sort of things that you feel comfortable talking about. And you have a right, obviously, at any point to, to change the subject or say, I don't want to talk about it.
In your experience, what are some common barriers that prevent individuals from seeking therapy in the first place?
Okay.
And is there any way that we can help overcome them?
Yeah. Oh, man. Great questions on this podcast, right? I guess the biggest piece here, that the first thing that came to mind was cost, which kind of leads to accessibility. Is therapy accessible to everybody? And right now, no, right? I don't think it necessarily is. Unless you have employment insurance, there's a significant impact of the cost of therapy to individuals, which stops them accessing services. So no, I think that's the biggest barrier right now. I think how we can overcome that piece is, I think there's a rise of the public sector stepping up in this area, right? We recently saw the Ontario Structured Psychotherapy program being offered in most mental health agencies, and it's completely free of cost. And there's workbooks, and you get a one-to-one psychotherapist for 30 minutes every 2 weeks. So I think really having the public sector sort of step up to fill in those gaps would be a nice support for sort of handling this barrier.
Right, because the public sector is aware that there's almost a crisis going on in people's mental health, because, people, especially since the pandemic, like, we're so much more aware of what's going on in our own mental health and in our lives, and the need to, address those things and get support, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's becoming apparent, and the public sector is working to address it. But then there's always kind of the lag of getting things through Congress and getting the funding for everything and then actually rolling out, right? And then an election happens and it kind of shifts again. So
absolutely, great points. Absolutely. It seems definitely a lot slower than we all hope for that process to look like or whatnot.
Yeah.
Is that the bounce back program that you're talking about, or is it something different?
This one's the Ontario Structured Psychotherapy program. So it maybe in some parts,
just what you described
sounds
like it's like an Ontario program, or maybe it's in a few provinces, but it's a similar thing where it has workbooks and it has a counselor you can meet with.
I'm not sure. I know lots of agencies got the funding, and I don't know, maybe they have different names for it, but I think that's where sort of the grant money fell under, is sort of this Ontario Psychotherapy. So bounce back sounds good. I'll definitely look it up. Anywhere I can get free resources for clients.
Yeah,
I'm like, and this as well. And I think that speaks volumes as well. Like oftentimes somebody will have a clinician, a private psychotherapist, but then there's other things that could sort of support that process and that therapeutic process. So people aren't just doing their work in our therapy sessions. They're reading books, they're listening to podcasts, as we're doing right now. I think that's part of the structure as well, of filling in those gaps, not just seeing a therapist and then being done with that work.
Right. Because you have clients who are coming in and maybe they're, they can afford coming once a month. Right. So then they're trying to kind of fill the gaps for their own mental health, which I think is incredible that they're taking that initiative to do so. And also the fact that there's actual resources available now that people can use. I mean, do you think that it's the same quality of mental health care as coming to a therapist every week?
Should I answer that honestly here? No, I don't think it could be created equal at all. I worked in the public sector for, over 15 years in many different capacities. And I don't think that they could keep up with private practice funds, with prices. It's just not sustainable for the amount of that workforce. So at this time, no, I'm not seeing that. And that's the feedback I'm getting even from crisis 24-hour lines. Clients are saying, well, this is this new suicide prevention line, crisis line, but the therapists aren't very helpful on that line. So, sorry who's hearing this, but I want to sort of pass along the messages from my clients. So no, I don't think they're all created equally. But I mean, we can say that in private practice too. There are amazing therapists, and then there are some that we still have some work to do. And I think that's just natural as well. Also in the public sector, there's more bureaucracy, right? There's a lot of paperwork, there's procedures. We do have those regulations and procedures, but they are coming directly from our colleges. And these are sort of, standards of support. Whereas I think in the public sector, there's a lot more processing, which again takes time, which takes money, which takes away from the actual
and they're having to report so that they can keep the funds rolling in, right? So that they can, keep their sign on the door.
Absolutely.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, great point, Kathleen. Great point.
Yeah. So I think from my experience, I've seen there's almost classes of people that can access mental health care, right? And I would say for a private practice, it tends to be middle to upper class people that can either have really good benefits from their really great job, or they can pay out of pocket. And there's a need at every socioeconomic level for mental health care, but the quality is different between publicly funded services versus privately owned services, right? So I think there's definitely an inequity there.
Absolutely. And we see even with the change of the job force, right? Companies are getting away from full-time employment, and so where do those benefits go? There's a whole bunch of people that are losing out on that. Now those with full benefits have great benefits, right? Bell is one of them. I'm really sort of proud of them. I don't know if that shout out is appropriate, but I know that one of the clients I support is say, hey, we told Bell to put their money where their mouth was. Right. They kept talking about Bell Let's Talk support, but yet, their resources and funding for therapy was very little. So now they have like 100% coverage, and they can go as many times as they want. They can go once a week. They can go once a day. And it's covered. So I think that's where I would love to see this type of support. And I think it is transitioning as we see sort of insurance companies, starting to be the leader of how money is spent with therapy and all of these resources. So I think we're in the midst of some change too in the industry.
Yeah, for sure. Jessica, you spoke to some of the inequity in socioeconomic realities that people are facing today and how that's impacting their access to services. And I want to speak a little bit about something near to my heart, which is geographic locations, right? I grew up in a northern community. It was quite remote. And then after university, I moved to a very remote community, worked in some fly-in communities. And I've just witnessed that the mental health crisis in those communities is so much greater because people are isolated. The stigma is still there. I would say people are 10, 20, 30 years behind on the level of stigma that still exists around getting mental health care. And then even when they step out to get that mental health care, the resources are just not available. I would say there's more available now with getting virtual care, but people feel that's a barrier to services and they're skeptical about it or wary of getting online with someone and telling them everything that's going on in their life. The big picture in Canada is that most people do live in remote communities, and it feels like we still have a long way to go in getting services to people. We're lucky we live close to the GTA. We're kind of at the cutting edge of what's happening in Ontario and the services that are coming into our community. And we also have, more of a voice in Parliament on what's happening in mental health and what services are available. So I think in that way, as the barriers are coming down, we are the first ones to benefit from it. We're talking a little bit about some socio-political realities that have shaped how mental health looks today, but I'm thinking a little bit about the history of mental health in Canada. And I think if you went back a generation or certainly 2 generations, like my grandparents' time, mental health, it wasn't called mental health. Let's face it. It was called something completely different. But, people that were mentally unwell, severely mentally unwell, were sent off to institutions, right? It was kind of a shame on the family. I'm thinking about that I don't know if you know the old Simon and Garfunkel song, Mrs. Robinson, right? Where it's about someone that's gone off to an institution. And I think the treatment there of individuals was downright abusive in some cases. I think there's a lot of experimental stuff going on because of professionals' understanding of mental health. So then that was playing into things. And then societal stigma was at an all-time high, I think, towards people that were mentally unwell. And there's just such a misunderstanding of what it meant to be unwell. So I think the journey from there to where we are here has been long. There have been many struggles along the way, but I think, the fact that we're able to access mental health resources and it's more acceptable than it was back then or even 10 years ago is a really big thing.
Absolutely, Kathleen. Even within my own lifetime, when I was in high school, I think we were starting to talk maybe a little bit about mental health, but it was not, I don't think it was very mainstream, and it was very unusual, at least in my perception at the time, for people to go to therapy. It wasn't really something you were open about. And now, of course, this isn't universal, but the general trend seems to be that, especially with teenagers and youth today, they are very, very open about their mental health. And a lot of them are in therapy and will even, talk to their friends about, something that their therapist said, or, share mental health resources and videos and things like that. So I think that that's really, really a positive thing. We've come so far in such a long time. Obviously it's not perfect. We can always improve. We have a ways left to go. But yeah, like you said, our grandparents' generation with, the asylums and things like that. And then all the way to just sort of the 80s and 90s where it just, wasn't really a thing. And now it's, like I said, it's a pretty mainstream thing that is talked about.
I want to know what role societal expectations and cultural influences play in shaping people's attitudes towards seeking therapy and how you address those influences.
Yeah, absolutely. I think those are very important considerations. When you're looking also at cultural expectations, I think it's important to remember that everybody has culture, right? And culture isn't just, your background or your customs. It can include the culture, within your family or within your school or within your workplace, right? There's layers of it. I think the way that I like to approach this is honestly with like a very genuine curiosity, almost like an anthropologist or something. Like I really try to sort of help people identify, some people are already very, very well aware of what sort of the expectations and impacts are of people's perspective on mental health around them. Some people are not, but helping them explore that and articulate that, I guess that helps to highlight some of the potential resources they might have in terms of like a support network, as well as some of the barriers they might face. For example, if they're from a family or a cultural group or a religion or something that for whatever reason does not, support the counseling process or does not, believe that mental health is a thing that exists. Yeah. So I think I really let the client tell me about their experience, and then we sort of work together to navigate that.
I mean, social workers love the word intersectionality.
Yes.
Right? We're kind of looking at all the pieces of what makes you you, and whether it's your history, your upbringing, your experiences. So all these pieces kind of play into what makes you you and how you're viewing the world, what kind of lens you're looking through, right? Would you say that exploring that with a client is a way of actually addressing barriers? We're not just talking about barriers to getting into the therapy room at this point. We're talking about barriers to actually step outside yourself and get a little perspective on the concerns that you're coming in with, right? So that you can see things from a different angle, perhaps, or see things clearly, or whatever needs to happen for you in that moment in that therapy chair.
Absolutely. And I think that, the therapist also asking questions and having this curiosity about the client helps the client to, if they don't already have, some curiosity about themselves, it helps them become curious about their own experiences and hopefully to understand themselves a little better or a little differently. I mean, that does a few things. I think that helps to build the therapeutic relationship, right? It's the therapist getting to know the client as well as the client getting to know themselves. It can help reveal barriers and challenges that maybe we can, find a way to navigate. And it can also reveal, sources of strength, support, social network, things like that. I think it can be a little therapeutic in itself, sometimes even just being able to sort of say things out loud or lay everything out on the table or have that different perspective on it.
One of the talking points here, Kathleen, that you set up for us was what are some main misconceptions about therapy or accessing therapy, or people who access therapy, people with mental health conditions. And sort of two major ones came up. And so the first myth is people with mental health are violent. I hear this a lot. I've worked in crisis environments most of my career. It is simply just not the case, but mainstream media or regular population seems to have this misconception. So the fact is that most people with mental health conditions are no more likely to be violent than anyone else. And actually only 3 to 5% of violent acts can be attributed to individuals living with serious mental illness. And the more interesting fact and that we should be more concerned about is people with severe mental illness are over 10 times more likely to be victims of violent crimes than the general population. So actually it's the opposite, right? We're sort of seeing actually they are victims of high violent crimes. And same with the developmental disability community. I just wanted to sort of piggyback that off. The second myth I hear the most often is mental health issues is a result of personality weakness or character flaws, and people can just snap out of it if they just try hard enough. And so this one is another one that speaks dear to me for many reasons. I'm not going to get into them at this moment, but let's look at some of the facts here. So mental health conditions really have nothing to do with being lazy or weak, right? That's just sort of set that bar right off the bat. And there are many factors that contribute to mental health conditions. So 3 of those are biological factors: your genes, physical illnesses, injuries, and brain chemistry. The second one is your life experience experiences, right? Trauma or any sort of history of abuse. And I mean, I'm just simplifying this right here, but these are the three major factors. And then the third is sort of family history of mental health conditions. And so what does that look like? And the genetic makeup there, and sort of learned behavior through time as somebody's growing and developing. So those were kind of the ones that I really wanted to speak to. I'm sure there's many, but those ones were kind of dear to me.
And speaking to some of the points that Jessica was making earlier about accessing mental health and making clients feel comfortable in, the therapy setting, just one thing that, is important to me, and it's something that I don't know if all therapists do this. I would hope that a lot of them do. But even trying to be attentive to the type of language that we use and the type of assumptions that we make about people, right? I mean, I think, probably many people within the LGBTQ plus community or their allies have noticed, somebody asking you like, oh, so do you have a boyfriend, say, like assuming a heterosexual relationship. And that's something that, pretty early on, I've tried to be very conscious of, right? We all do have these. I mean, society has these biases. A lot of us have internalized some of it. And so we have to actively step outside of ourselves to address that. So I would emphasize asking, do you have a relationship? Which, maybe seems like a small thing, but I know from, talking to some of my clients who are within the LGBTQ plus community that has been a thing that has helped them to feel safe and to feel seen and to feel like, okay, I'm not just being slotted into this sort of heteronormative place. I have my own place that I can be.
No, and this is something that I see, I'm getting client inquiries through our email forums, and I've had many, many people ask me, hey, do you guys provide service for, we're a gay couple and we're looking for service? And I'm like, yeah, like who's not providing? But then I think there's maybe an underlying question of like, is this a safe space for me? And people are just unsure, and obviously had bad experiences or felt judged maybe in other contexts. And so that's why they're kind of testing the waters first before they commit to coming to therapy. So yeah, it is one of the barriers that could make it more difficult to access services. I would take a wild guess that statistically it would be more difficult for people from the LGBTQ plus community to access services and feel comfortable and safe and actually, be able to get the care they deserve and the care that they expect, and, be able to meet some of their therapeutic goals. We're about to wrap up the show, but before we do, I just want to know what advice you have for individuals who want to address their mental health concerns, but they're hesitant about starting therapy.
Well, we've talked about this in previous podcasts, how the therapeutic relationship is so important to the therapeutic process, to both feeling comfortable initially and then to being able to collaborate, identify goals, and work towards them. So I tell people, and I will tell clients this when they come in as well, that, don't be afraid to try out multiple therapists, right? I have a lot of empathy for people who, maybe they tried out therapy, but, they didn't click with the first therapist or the second therapist. And then they decided, I've given it a shot. I don't like it. It doesn't work. That's valid to feel that way. But I guess if I could tell people going in, like, don't be afraid to meet with 2, 3, 4 different therapists to see if you vibe with somebody.
Yeah, for sure. No, and I mean, it ties a little bit back to the barriers piece, because I know if I'm going to spend $150+ on something, then I want to make sure it's going to, really get my value for it. Mm-hmm. Right. So yeah, I think it's just about managing expectations for clients too, and realizing, okay, just because, if you're feeling money's a little bit tight and you've invested, it doesn't mean you have to stay with that therapist if it's not going well. Right. Mm-hmm. So this is where maybe you're spacing out your sessions, or maybe you're implementing, other mental health resources that you can kind of supplement with if you're finding it's challenging to afford sessions. And then, otherwise, I mean, in the end, you want to be able to meet your therapeutic goals. So it doesn't matter how much money you're dropping on a therapist you don't like, you don't trust, you don't want to talk to, because in the end, that's not going to get you where you want to go, right, with your therapy goals. And we're all about seeing people get better. That's what we want to see here at Reset Barrie. And so thank you, Andi and Jessica, for coming in today and sharing all your thoughts about unveiling mental health myths. And we'll see you next time on the show.
Thanks, Kathleen.